All right, so today we're diving into a topic that's really tough to grapple with: modern slavery.
Yeah, it's a heavy one for sure.
But it's so important that we really shine a light on it. And today, specifically, we're going to be looking at two cases that really bring a whole new layer of complexity to the issue.
Definitely. Cases that really challenge some of the assumptions we might have about who's involved in these horrific situations.
Exactly. I mean, we're going to be looking at two cases where individuals of African descent are both the victims and the perpetrators.
And it really gets to the heart of just how deeply rooted and global this problem truly is. We often think of slavery as something from the past, a bygone era.
Right, right. But these cases show us just how wrong that is.
Exactly.
So in one case, we have a young West African girl held captive for get this, 16 years.
16 years.
16 years in a suburb of all places, South Lake, Texas.
Wow.
And her captors were a Guinean couple.
And then in the other case, we have a Nigerian teenager enduring forced labor for 24 years.
24.
At the hands of a British couple. But again, a couple of African descent.
And it's that last part that I think is so crucial to unpack here, because it forces us to confront some really difficult truths about the nature of exploitation, the fact that it can happen anywhere, to anyone, and even within communities that share a common heritage.
Absolutely. It really shatters those preconceived notions we might have about perpetrators and victims, Like, it can be really easy to distance ourselves from these issues, to think, oh, this happens somewhere else, or to those people.
Yeah.
But these cases really drive home the point that modern slavery is not confined to any one region or culture or even race.
Right. So let's start unraveling these cases. And I think the one in Texas is a good place to begin. Because it's just so jarring to imagine this happening in a place like South Lake, Texas. And we're talking about a quiet, affluent suburb, the kind of place you see on TV shows,
Right. You wouldn't think something like this could happen there.
Exactly. But behind closed doors, this young girl's life was being absolutely torn apart. She was brought to the U.S. at such a young age, separated from her family, who tried desperately to protect her, and then just thrust into this world of absolute control by this Guinean couple, Mohamed Tour and Denise Cross Tour.
And I think this is where we see that stark power imbalance really come into play. The Tours were wealthy, politically connected. They came from very influential families back in Guinea.
And they used that position to exploit this young girl who came from a poor rural village, had very limited options, almost no voice.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. And the abuse she suffered is just horrific. Forced labor, constant verbal degradation, physical violence. She was denied even a basic education.
It's almost unbelievable,
I know. And what's even more jarring is that, their own biological children were given every opportunity to thrive. Sent to good schools, had all the advantages, and this young girl was just robbed of her childhood, her adolescence, her chance to build a life, all while living in this community that probably had no idea what was happening right under their noses.
And that's a really important point to bring up, because these situations often thrive in secrecy. The perpetrators often use isolation as a weapon, cutting off the victim from any potential support or any way to escape.
And how do they do that?
I mean, there's a lot of different tactics. They might exploit language barriers or cultural differences, or even the victim's fear of authorities, to maintain that control. It's a carefully constructed web of manipulation and coercion.
And in this case, this young woman endured this for 16 years. Can you imagine?
It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is. But in 2016, something incredible happened. Her neighbors noticed something wasn't right. They saw signs of distress, of fear, and they chose to act.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
It is. And it was their courage that ultimately helped her escape that nightmare.
And it really underscores the critical role that community awareness plays in these situations, because these cases rarely fit the stereotypes we might have about slavery. They're often hidden in plain sight, and it takes someone who's paying attention, who's willing to speak up, to bring it to light. And that brings us to our second case, a world away in Britain. This young Nigerian teenager, he was lured to the UK by the promise of, a better life, education, a good job, a chance to escape poverty.
The classic, immigrant story, right?
Right. But instead of finding opportunity, he walked into a prison disguised as a home.
And his captors were a British couple.
Originally from Africa themselves.
And they systematically stripped him of his identity, his freedom. They took his passport, isolated him from the outside world, and forced him into relentless labor. I mean, we're talking up to 17 hours a day. No pay, constant threats, just absolute control over every aspect of his life.
And it's this case, I think, that really reveals a deeply troubling truth about modern slavery. It can exist even within communities that share, cultural or ethnic backgrounds.
Because the assumption is that they would understand the struggle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You would think there would be that shared understanding, that empathy, but the perpetrators here, they use that shared heritage to manipulate their victim, maybe preying on a sense of trust or
It's
obligation.
sort of betrayal of that shared history.
Exactly. And it's a stark reminder that exploitation can occur across all borders, even within seemingly homogenous groups.
It really shakes up your assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It makes you wonder, how do we even begin to address something so insidious, so deeply woven into the fabric of our society?
Yeah, it's a daunting question for sure, but it's one we have to grapple with if we want to make a difference.
Absolutely. But before we get into that, let's delve a little deeper into the specifics of this second case.
Yeah.
Because, 24 years. Can you even fathom that? 24 years stolen from this young man's life.
It's mind-boggling, and it really highlights the long-term impact of these crimes. It's not just about the physical labor, it's about the systematic breaking down of a human being over years and years.
And the fact that, just like in the Texas case, it was neighbors who finally helped bring this situation to light. They noticed things that seemed off, signs of distress, isolation, and they had the courage to speak up.
Yeah.
Which, again, emphasizes the power of just paying attention, right? Of recognizing that something isn't right.
Yeah.
And taking action.
Absolutely. These cases are a powerful reminder that we can't just sit back and assume that slavery is a problem of the past. It's happening right now in our own backyards and often hidden in plain sight. And it's up to all of us to be vigilant, to be aware, and to be willing to act.
Okay, so we've set the scene with these two incredibly disturbing cases, but what do they tell us about the bigger picture? What are the common threads here, and what can we learn from them? Let's unpack that in the next part of our deep dive.
It's really striking, when you look at these two cases, how similar the tactics were that the enslavers used, even though, they were separated by continents and culture.
Right, like it's that same pattern of isolation and manipulation. It's chilling.
Yeah, and it's a calculated exploitation of vulnerabilities.
That's what's so insidious about modern slavery. There's not always those overt, chains and whips and those kinds of images we might have in our heads. It's about control and coercion and preying on people who are already at a disadvantage. And in both these cases, both victims were brought from impoverished backgrounds, lured by that promise of a better life.
Exactly. It's that hope, that desperation that the enslavers weaponize.
Yeah, and they create this world where escape seems impossible, by isolating them, controlling their access to information, instilling fear. Think about the Texas case. The victim was denied an education, which keeps her dependent, less likely to challenge her captors. In the UK case, the victim's passport was taken.
Oh, wow.
Which robs him of his legal identity and makes him feel trapped.
Right.
So it's like they systematically strip away any sense of agency or hope.
Yeah.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that both sets of enslavers were themselves immigrants, who had achieved a level of success. They weren't struggling to survive, They were actively choosing to exploit someone from a similar background.
And that adds another layer of complexity to this, doesn't it? It challenges our understanding of power dynamics and the motivations behind these crimes, because we tend to think of slavery as this very black and white issue, but these cases show us the shades of gray, the internal conflicts, the cultural nuances that contribute to this phenomenon.
It's like a twisted mirror image of the immigrant success story, right? Where instead of uplifting others from their community, they're exploiting them for personal gain. And I think that's a crucial point for our listeners to really grasp, that modern slavery isn't just some historical artifact. It's happening right now, often within our own communities, and it's not always easy to spot.
Yeah, we have to be aware of the subtle signs, the red flags that might indicate that someone is being controlled or exploited.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, it could be, a neighbor who's constantly working but never seems to have any money, or a a child who's withdrawn and fearful and never allowed to play with other kids.
It's about paying attention, trusting your gut, and being willing to ask questions.
And I think it's also about understanding those systemic factors that make certain individuals more vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. You know, poverty, lack of education, language barriers, unstable political situations. All of these things can create an environment where exploitation can thrive. And in both these cases, we see the impact of cultural dynamics too, right? Where there might be a misplaced sense of trust.
Yeah.
Or a fear of bringing shame to the family, or a reluctance to involve authorities. And those cultural nuances are often misunderstood or overlooked, but they play a significant role in how these situations persist.
Which is why community awareness is so vital.
Yes.
Neighbors, friends, teachers, anyone who interacts with potential victims needs to be educated about the signs of modern slavery.
Because sometimes a simple act of noticing, of asking a question can be the catalyst that breaks the cycle of abuse. And remember, in both of these cases, it was neighbors who ultimately sounded the alarm.
Yeah. They saw something that didn't feel right, and they chose to act.
Exactly. And that's the takeaway I hope our listeners really internalize. Modern slavery it's a complex issue, but it's not insurmountable. By understanding the dynamics, recognizing the signs, and fostering a sense of community vigilance, we can all contribute to ending this horrific practice.
So we've delved into the unsettling details of these two cases and explored the broader implications. Now let's shift our focus to what we can do about it. How do we move beyond awareness to action? What steps can we take to dismantle the systems that allow modern slavery to persist? Let's unpack that in the final part of our deep dive. We've really dug deep into some dark territory in this deep dive, and it can feel overwhelming.
It is heavy stuff.
Yeah. But I think it's important to remember that there is hope. Right? I mean, there are things we can all do to fight back against this injustice. And I think it starts with understanding that modern slavery isn't just a problem over there,
Right.
It's a global issue. It demands our attention no matter where we live.
And these two cases, they highlight the complexities of exploitation within communities of African descent.
Right.
But modern slavery affects people of all backgrounds, all nationalities.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do we even begin?
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? What can we actually do about this?
Well, I think a good first step is educating ourselves about the signs,
Okay.
The more we understand about how traffickers operate and the subtle ways they control their victims, the better equipped we'll be to spot those red flags.
So what are some of those red flags? What should we be looking for?
Well, it could be things like sudden changes in behavior or signs of physical abuse or someone who just seems, fearful or withdrawn or like they're constantly being watched.
Right.
Those can all be indicators that something's not right.
Okay. So we're paying attention, we're being vigilant. What about on a more systemic level,
Yeah.
What can we do to address those root causes that make people vulnerable to exploitation in the first place?
Well, that's where, supporting organizations that are working on the front lines becomes so crucial. I mean, there are incredible groups out there that are dedicated to rescuing victims, providing them with support, and working to disrupt trafficking networks. And many of them also focus on addressing things like poverty, lack of education, and other factors that contribute to that vulnerability.
So donating to these organizations or volunteering our time, spreading awareness about the work they do, that can make a real impact.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of simply having these conversations, The more we talk about modern slavery, the more we break the stigma and the silence that allow it to thrive.
Right. And speaking of breaking the silence, I think one of those powerful things we can do is advocate for stronger laws and policies that protect victims.
Right.
And hold traffickers accountable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Contacting your elected officials, supporting legislation that's aimed at combating human trafficking, demanding justice for survivors. I mean, these actions can make a real difference on a broader scale.
Yeah. And we can also be mindful of our own consumer choices, right? Like supporting businesses that are committed to ethical sourcing and fair labor practices.
Exactly.
I mean, that can help prevent exploitation in supply chains.
Yeah. I mean, it all comes down to using our voices and our choices and our resources to create a world where slavery in any form is simply unacceptable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm going to leave you with this thought. We might not be able to single-handedly eradicate modern slavery, but we can all play a role in exposing it, disrupting it, and ultimately creating a more just and equitable world. It starts with awareness, but it doesn't end there. Let's take action. Let's be the generation that says enough is enough and finally consign slavery to the history books where it belongs.